played those launch titles across platforms, which were basically glorified tech demos, or worse still, previous gen games which were ported to the new hardware at the last minute. It's fair to say that the PlayStation launch lineups have been incredibly inconsistent over the last few generations, and between the 5 flagship consoles and 2 handhelds, there's a share of flop releases among the bunch. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 10 worst PlayStation launch games ever. Number 10. GENJI Days of the Blade, PS3. The only thing anyone remembers about GENJI Days of the Blade is its meme-friendly, historically accurate battle against a giant enemy crab, because there's little else here worthwhile. Like so many console launch games, this inaugural PS3 title boasts shiny graphics, yet precious little soul. And much like its predecessor, GENJI Dawn of the Samurai, this one basically just feels like generic action-adventure game. Even forgiving its patent lack of personality, beyond the aforementioned giant enemy crab of course, the controls and camera are painfully counterintuitive, ensuring that hacking through hordes of enemies becomes a tiresome bore incredibly fast. Despite its glossy coat of next-gen paint, the gameplay never feels like it graduated from the PS2, ensuring GENJI quickly fell into the abyss where it's largely been forgotten ever since. Number 9. Knack, PS4. Oh, Knack! Though this mascot platformer is at least one of the more basically competent games on this list, it's also one of the most crushingly disappointing. Directed by legendary Sony designer Mark Cerny, Knack was hyped up as a gemstone in the PS4's relatively so-so launch lineup, with many hoping it'd make the most of the DualShock 4's innovative new features while offering up fond memories of the earlier Crash Bandicoot games. In the end, Knack was, how shall we put it, a bit boring. Knack wasn't a terribly interesting protagonist, the platforming didn't make particularly creative use of his form-shifting abilities, and perhaps worst of all, the difficulty level and checkpoint placement was shockingly punishing for a game basically aimed at children. Despite the original receiving its share of critical scorn, Knack 2 was released in 2016 to relatively decent reviews. Number 8. KILEAK, the DNA Imperative, PS1. One of the PlayStation's first ever forays into the FPS genre, KILEAK, the DNA Imperative, was a mech-based shooter light on plot and heavy on repetitive shoot-'em-up nonsense, in a series of visually unappealing, almost impossibly grey arenas and hallways. This isn't exactly the aesthetic to best show off any console's hardware potential, and though the shooting itself is possible for the era, the excess of keycard collecting and switch throwing ensures that this one quickly becomes a real drag. With drab visuals and a core loop that struggles to maintain interest, this is exactly the sort of launch title no player wants to be saddled with. A sequel, Epidemic, was rushed out less than a year later and received similarly scathing critical notices from the press. Number 7. EVERGRACE, PS2. Famously panned by even the UK and US editions of official PlayStation magazine, this early action RPG offering from future Dark Souls developers From Software was ultimately a warmed-over genre retread with little to distinguish itself from its competition. It's worth noting that EVERGRACE was originally conceived for the PS1, and much of its old-gen DNA clearly carried over into the PS2 release, which just doesn't look or play slickly enough to suggest it belonged on Sony's newfangled hardware. Given that FromSoft released 3 games in the PS2's launch window, the other 2 being Eternal Ring and Armored Core 2, it's tough not to feel like they probably spread themselves a little too thinly here and the quality suffered. It's acceptable to fiddle around with for an hour or so, but there's little here to keep players coming back. Number 6. Asphalt Injection, PS Vita. What would any PlayStation launch be without a racing game? This launch title for the PlayStation Vita was a shamelessly down and dirty rush job, clearly churned out by developers Gameloft for a mere quick buck. From its embarrassingly basic visuals to the underwhelming sound effects and horrendously unresponsive controls, Asphalt Injection isn't any better than a free mobile racing game you'd play today, except the developers had the goal to charge a full retail price for it. Like the very worst of races, the tracks just feel completely barren and empty, the AI is terrible, and there's no palpable sense of speed whatsoever. Unsurprisingly, many critics pegged this the worst of all the Vita's launch titles, and they'd be right. Number 5. ORPHEN, SCION of SORCERY, PS2. Orphen Scion of Sorcery was a PS2 launch title in Europe and North America, and was adapted from the Japanese light novel series Sorcerer's Stabber Orphen. Despite its cult favorite source material, Orphen's a curiously thin game on both a plot and character front. No doubt unaided by nails on a chalkboard voice acting and graphics that looked just passable, even in 2000. But what really kills Orphen is its painfully boring battle system, fixing players in place as they mechanically hurl attack after attack at their enemies, while the titular protagonist spits out the same tired soundbite for the 900th time. When you could have been playing the likes of SSX, Time Splitters, or Tekken Tag Tournament on your shiny new PS2, why would you ever have settled for this? Number 4. Power Serve 3D Tennis, PS1. As simple as the quality tennis game might seem today, back in '95 that wasn't quite the case. Enter Power Serve 3D Tennis, a shockingly inept attempt to bring the sport to the original PlayStation's launch lineup. A game which, even if you can accept its dated visuals, is an absolute disaster from a gameplay perspective. There are two key problems here. The controls are tantamount to dragging your chosen tennis player through treacle, and the game is absolutely riddled with bugs. Even basic collision detection between your racket and the ball is totally off, and those brave enough to experiment with doubles mode will find themselves able to clip through their partner like they're nothing. Even with all these issues though, it still wasn't quite the worst PS1 launch title, but more on that shortly. Number 3. Rengoku: The Tower of Purgatory, PSP. Rengoku: The Tower of Purgatory is such a non-event of a PSP launch title, it doesn't even have its own Wikipedia page. Nevertheless, this third-person action-adventure romp was mercilessly stomped by most critics upon release. For despite the inherent appeal of controlling a well-armed battle android, Rengoku is disastrous from start to finish. To begin with the game's fatal flaw, its control scheme is horrendously unintuitive, which, combined with the soul-destroyingly dull, even lazy level design, makes for an incredibly snoozy experience. From basic navigation to combat to upgrades, everything in this game feels like far more of a chore than it should. In a game so aesthetically bland and lifeless, it's a deadly pairing which ensures that few have more than a passing memory of this one's existence. Number 2. Mobile Suit Gundam CROSSFIRE, PS3. All Mobile Suit Gundam CROSSFIRE had to be was an enjoyably brainless mech shooter, but it somehow couldn't even achieve that basic goal. Pretty much everything that could fail in this game does. The graphics are muddy and reminiscent of the PS2, the sound effects are weak and lacking, the controls are stiff, the AI is dreadful, it's full of glitches, and it even struggles to maintain a consistent frame rate. This is the rare sort of bad that doesn't really feel fit for sale, and so it's little surprise that it ended up scoring an impressively awful 33 on Metacritic. Mobile Suit Gundam CROSSFIRE truly is one of the worst launch titles ever to cross Sony's desk, but it's not quite the worst of the worst. Number 1. Street Fighter the Movie, PS1. A video game based on a movie based on a video game, Street Fighter the Movie was a launch title for the original PlayStation, and much like its widely maligned cinematic forebear, absolute garbage. Despite the obvious appeal of the game featuring the digitized likenesses of the movie's cast, the myriad technical issues quickly make players yearn for the classic 2D sprites instead. Between the frame rate drops, slowdown, choppy digitized animations, and long loading times, it's painfully clear that Capcom quickly curled this one out for a quick buck. Though on paper this could have been a rare case of a game improving upon the movie it was adapted from, in the end the wafer-thin production values make the movie a far more appealing prospect. It's absolutely vital that fighting games are mechanically precise and technically flawless, and Street Fighter the Movie is a categorical dud in both respects. That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other examples of the worst PlayStation launch games ever. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hello to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming lists.